I never expected to inherit anything from my father. We hadn't spoken in over 3 years when the lawyer called to tell me about the farm. Standing in the doorway of the old barn, I felt the weight of abandonment pressing down on my shoulders like the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. The property looked exactly as I remembered from childhood visits, before the arguments, before the silence that grew between us like weeds in an untended field. The red paint on the barn was peeling, revealing gray wood underneath that had weathered countless storms. Inside, covered by a blue tarp that had seen better days, sat Dad's old Massey Ferguson tractor. I pulled away the tarp, releasing a cloud of dust that made me cough. The machine looked tired, defeated somehow. Its red paint had faded to a dull rust color, and the black seat was cracked from years of sun exposure. According to the neighbors, it hadn't run in at least 5 years. Dad had apparently given up trying to fix it, just like he'd given up on so many other things toward the end. The silence in the barn felt heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant sound of wind through the fields. I ran my hand along the tractor's hood, feeling the rough texture of oxidized metal beneath my palm. This machine had been Dad's pride and joy once, back when I was small enough to ride on his lap while he worked the fields. Now it was just another piece of his legacy that I didn't know what to do with. The next morning, I decided to see if the old machine had any life left in it. I'd learned enough about engines during my years working construction to know the basics. The key was still in the ignition, hanging from a worn leather fob that Dad had made himself decades ago. I turned the key. Nothing. Not even the suggestion of a spark. I popped the hood and examined the engine. The battery terminals were corroded white and green, like some strange fungus had taken root in the metal. The air filter was clogged with debris, and several belts had cracked with age. It would need more than a quick fix to bring this machine back to life. Over the next few days, I made trips to the local auto parts store, gathering supplies. The clerk, an elderly man named Frank, who claimed to have known my father, shook his head when I described the tractor's condition. "That old Ferguson's been sitting dead for years," he said, ringing up my purchases. "Your dad used to come in here regular like, buying parts, trying to keep her running. But toward the end there, he just stopped trying." I spent hours working on the engine, replacing what I could afford and cleaning what I couldn't. The work felt meditative somehow, my hands moving with muscle memory I didn't know I possessed. Dad had taught me to use tools when I was young, before everything went wrong between us. But despite my efforts, the tractor remained stubbornly silent. Working on the tractor brought back memories I'd tried to forget. I remembered being 7 years old, sitting on Dad's lap while he drove through the cornfields. His hands had been steady on the wheel, weathered from years of farm work, but gentle when they needed to be. "Someday this'll all be yours, son," he'd said, his voice carrying over the rumble of the engine. "The land, the equipment, all of it. But more important than that, you'll understand what it means to work with your hands, to create something from nothing." I'd believed him then, believed in the future he painted with his words, where I would follow in his footsteps and continue the family tradition. But life had other plans. College, career opportunities in the city, and eventually the fights about my choices had driven a wedge between us that seemed impossible to remove. The last conversation we'd had was about this very tractor. He'd called me, drunk and rambling, complaining about how nothing worked anymore, how everything was breaking down around him. I told him to sell the farm, move to town, get on with his life. He'd hung up on me, and we never spoke again. Now, 3 years later, I was the one trying to make sense of the pieces he'd left behind. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was fighting to resurrect the same machine I'd once told him to abandon. Each bolt I loosened, each part I cleaned, felt like a small act of penance for the years of silence between us. Word travels fast in small farming communities. Within a week of my arrival, neighbors began stopping by to offer advice, tools, and stories about my father. Each visitor seemed to have a different theory about what was wrong with the tractor. "Probably the fuel pump," suggested Mrs. Henderson from the adjacent property. She brought me a casserole and stood watching while I worked. These old machines, the fuel systems go first. Tom Mitchell, who farmed the land to the south, disagreed. It's electrical, guaranteed. Your dad was always having trouble with shorts in the wiring. Mice get in there, chew up the insulation. A younger farmer named Jake, whose property bordered the back 40, offered to tow the tractor to his shop. I've got all the diagnostic equipment, he said. Could have it running in a day or two. But something made me resist their offers of help. This felt like something I needed to do myself, a conversation between my father and me that had been interrupted years ago and was only now finding its voice through rusted metal and seized pistons. I thanked them all politely and continued my solitary work in the barn. The tractor kept its secrets, refusing to respond to any of my efforts. But I was stubborn, a trait I'd inherited from Dad, whether I liked it or not. After 2 weeks of failed attempts, I decided to go deeper into the machine's mechanical heart. I removed the starter, took apart the carburetor, and even pulled the spark plugs to check the cylinders. Everything looked worn, but functional. There was no obvious reason why the engine wouldn't at least turn over. Frustration began to creep in. I'd taken vacation time from my job in the city, expecting to sort through Dad's belongings and decide what to do with the property. Instead, I found myself obsessing over a piece of machinery that seemed determined to take its secrets to the grave. The barn had become my workshop, tools spread across makeshift tables made from sawhorses and plywood. I'd even rigged up some work lights so I could continue into the evening hours. The familiar ritual of disassembly and cleaning had become almost meditative, a way to quiet the guilt and regret that seemed to follow me around the property. Late one evening, while examining the ignition system by lamplight, I heard footsteps outside the barn. Frank from the parts store appeared in the doorway, carrying a 6-pack of beer and wearing an expression of mild concern. "Thought you might could use some company," he said, settling onto a hay bale and offering me a bottle. "Your dad used to work late like this too, especially toward the end. Always tinkering, always hoping he could fix whatever was broken." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds being the clink of our bottles and the distant hum of insects in the fields. Frank had known my father for over 30 years, had sold him parts and listened to his complaints about everything from weather to government agricultural policies. Frank's visit opened a door to stories I'd never heard about my father's later years. Apparently, Dad had become something of a fixture at the local diner, holding court at the corner table and dispensing advice to younger farmers who were struggling with their own challenges. "He never stopped talking about you," Frank said, taking a long pull from his beer. "Even after you two had your falling out. Always wondering what you were up to in the city, whether you were happy with your choices." The words hit harder than I expected. In my mind, Dad had written me off completely after our last fight. Learning that he'd continued to think about me, to talk about me, complicated the narrative I'd constructed about our relationship. "Why didn't he call?" I asked. "If he was thinking about me, why didn't he pick up the phone?" Frank shrugged. "Pride, I suppose. Same thing that kept you from calling him. You're more alike than you probably want to admit." The next morning I attacked the tractor with renewed energy, but also with a growing sense that I was missing something fundamental. Every system I checked seemed functional, yet the machine remained as lifeless as a museum piece. I began to wonder if there was something else going on, some hidden problem that wasn't obvious from a standard mechanical inspection. I decided to remove the seat to check the wiring underneath. The seat was held down by 4 bolts that had rusted solid over the years. It took me the better part of an hour to work them loose, my hands cramping from the effort and my back aching from the awkward angle. When the seat finally lifted free, I expected to find a tangle of wires and maybe a mouse nest or two. Instead, I discovered a small metal box wedged into the space beneath the seat frame. It was wrapped in an old oilcloth and secured with electrical tape that had long since lost its adhesive properties. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled the package free. The oilcloth cracked and flaked away, revealing a hinged metal container about the size of a paperback book. Inside, protected from moisture and time, was a folded letter written in my father's distinctive handwriting. The paper was cream-colored stationery, the kind Dad used for important correspondence. My name was written across the front in careful block letters. For Michael, to be found when the time is right. I sat there in the dusty barn, holding the letter and trying to process what I'd discovered. Dad had hidden this message, knowing that someday I would inherit the tractor and presumably try to fix it. He'd counted on my stubbornness, on the mechanical curiosity he'd instilled in me as a child. The afternoon light slanted through the barn doors, creating a natural spotlight around the tractor. I could hear the distant sound of traffic on the county road, the normal rhythms of life continuing while my world shifted on its axis. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the letter and began to read words that would change everything I thought I knew about my father and our relationship. Son, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably cursing this old tractor for being so stubborn. I disabled the fuel solenoid 3 years ago, right after our last fight. I knew that someday you'd come back, and when you did, you'd try to fix what was broken. You always were that way. Even as a little boy, couldn't leave a puzzle unsolved. I want you to know that I never stopped being proud of you. I know I said some hard things during our last conversation, things I wish I could take back. I was scared, Michael. Scared of losing the farm, scared of being alone, and most of all, scared that I'd failed as a father. When you chose to leave for the city, I felt like everything I'd tried to teach you about the value of working the land had been worthless. But I was wrong. You didn't reject what I taught you. You just found a different way to build something meaningful with your life. I've been keeping track of your success through mutual friends, and I couldn't be more proud. You've built something good in that city, something that helps people and makes a difference. That's what farming is really about too, nurturing growth, tending to something bigger than yourself. The tractor will run fine once you reconnect the yellow wire under the fuel tank. I've kept all the maintenance records in the toolbox by the workbench. She's got a lot of good years left in her, just like this land has a lot of good years left in it. What you do with the farm is your choice. Keep it, sell it, or find some middle path I never considered. Whatever you decide, know that you have my blessing and my love. I'm sorry we ran out of time to say these things to each other properly. Your proud father, Robert. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Dad had sabotaged his own tractor, creating an elaborate puzzle that would bring me back to him one final time. The mechanical problem I'd been struggling with for weeks had been intentional, a father's last attempt to have a conversation with his son. I crawled under the tractor and found the disconnected yellow wire exactly where he'd said it would be. The connection was clean and simple. He'd just unplugged it and tucked it behind the fuel tank where it wouldn't be easily noticed during casual inspection. With shaking hands, I reconnected the wire and climbed back into the driver's seat. The key turned, the engine cranked, and for the first time in 3 years, the old Massey Ferguson roared to life. The sound was beautiful, a deep, throaty rumble that seemed to shake dust from every corner of the barn. I sat there listening to the engine idle, tears streaming down my face. The machine ran perfectly, its rhythm steady and strong. All those weeks of work, all that frustration, had been part of Dad's plan to make sure I understood something important about persistence, about not giving up on things that mattered. The letter was still clutched in my left hand, the paper soft from my grip. I read it again, hearing Dad's voice in every word. He'd found a way to apologize, to express pride, to offer forgiveness for the harsh words we'd exchanged. Most importantly, he'd given me permission to choose my own path while still honoring what he'd tried to teach me. Over the next few days, I began to understand the full scope of what Dad had orchestrated. The maintenance records he'd mentioned were indeed in the toolbox, meticulously organized and dating back to when he'd first bought the tractor, but they also included something else. Detailed notes about repairs he'd made to other equipment around the farm, improvements to the property, and even financial records showing that the land was in much better shape than I'd assumed. He'd spent his final years not just maintaining the farm, but preparing it for transition. The fields were healthy, the buildings were in good repair, and he'd even updated the water systems and electrical infrastructure. What I'd initially seen as neglect had actually been careful stewardship. I called my supervisor in the city and extended my leave. There was more to discover here, more conversations to have with my father through the work he'd left behind. Each task I undertook, fixing a fence, cleaning out the grain bins, servicing the other equipment, felt like another page in the letter he'd written with his actions. The neighbors noticed the change immediately. Smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney in the evenings, lights in the barn, the sound of machinery running properly for the first time in years. Mrs. Henderson brought over another casserole and mentioned how good it was to see the place coming back to life. Frank from the parts store stopped by to check on my progress and wasn't entirely surprised when I told him about the letter. "Your dad was always thinking 3 moves ahead," he said with a knowing smile. "He talked about that tractor puzzle for months, wondering if it would work, if you'd stick with it long enough to find what he'd hidden. Working the land gave me a different perspective on what my father had been trying to tell me all those years ago. It wasn't that he wanted me to become a farmer. It was that he wanted me to understand the value of nurturing something beyond myself, of taking responsibility for growth and continuity. I'd been doing exactly that in my city job, managing construction projects that provided homes for families, infrastructure that served communities. The skills were different, but the underlying principles were the same. Dad had understood this, even if I hadn't at the time. The tractor became my daily companion as I worked to restore the property. Every morning I'd climb into that cracked seat, start the engine, and spend hours moving around the farm. The machine ran beautifully, its engine humming with the contentment of something finally being used for its intended purpose. I found myself talking to Dad as I worked, updating him on my progress, sharing thoughts about decisions I was facing. The conversations felt natural, as if the letter had opened a channel of communication that death couldn't close. One evening, while watching the sunset from the tractor seat, I realized I'd been approaching the wrong question. Instead of asking whether I should keep the farm or sell it, I should have been asking how I could honor both Dad's legacy and my own path forward. The answer, when it came, felt inevitable. I would keep the land but lease it to Jake, the young farmer who'd offered to help with the tractor repairs. He needed more acreage to expand his operation, and I could maintain ownership while ensuring the land continued to be farmed properly. The arrangement with Jake worked perfectly. He brought energy and modern techniques to the operation while respecting the traditional methods Dad had used. I kept the farmhouse and a few acres around it, creating a retreat where I could escape the city and reconnect with the lessons Dad had tried to teach me. The old tractor found new purpose too. Jake used it for smaller tasks around the property, and I would often operate it myself during weekend visits. There was something deeply satisfying about the work, about feeling connected to the land and to generations of farmers who had worked this same soil. I had the letter framed and hung it in the farmhouse kitchen, where Dad used to plan his daily work over morning coffee. Reading it never got easier, but it did get more meaningful. Each time I discovered new layers of understanding, new appreciations for the care he'd put into his final message. The farm prospered under Jake's management. He introduced crop rotation techniques that improved soil health, invested in efficient irrigation systems, and even started a small organic operation that supplied local restaurants. The land was producing more than it had in years, fulfilling Dad's vision of growth and sustainability. During one of my weekend visits, Frank stopped by with news that the local historical society wanted to feature the farm in their annual tour. Apparently, the story of the hidden letter had become something of a local legend, inspiring other families to work through their own complicated relationships. "Your dad would have gotten a kick out of that," Frank said, watching me work on a section of fence that needed repair. He always said the best stories were the ones that helped other people figure out their own problems. 2 years after finding the letter, I stood in the same barn where this journey had begun, but everything was different now. The space was clean and organized, tools properly stored, equipment running smoothly. The old tractor sat in its place of honor, no longer hidden under a tarp, but ready for work whenever it was needed. I'd brought my own son to visit the farm, a 10-year-old city kid who was initially skeptical about spending time in what he called the middle of nowhere. But something magical happened when I lifted him onto the tractor seat and started the engine. His eyes lit up with the same wonder I must have shown at his age, and I could see him beginning to understand the connection between human hands and the land that feeds us. "Grandpa built all this?" he asked, his small hands gripping the steering wheel as we puttered slowly around the property. "He did," I replied, thinking about all the layers of meaning in that simple statement. But more than that, he understood something important about how we take care of each other across generations. The letter had taught me that love doesn't always express itself in the ways we expect. Sometimes it comes disguised as stubbornness, as puzzles that force us to slow down and pay attention, as mechanical problems that can only be solved through patience and persistence. Dad's final lesson had been about connection, not just between father and son, but between past and future, between different ways of building meaningful lives. The tractor had been his classroom, and the broken wire his way of ensuring I would sit still long enough to learn what he needed to teach me. As we drove back toward the barn, my son asked if he could try steering. I guided his small hands on the wheel, just as Dad had guided mine decades earlier. The cycle continued, passing knowledge and love from one generation to the next, ensuring that the important things would never be forgotten. The old tractor hummed contentedly beneath us, no longer broken, no longer silent, but alive with purpose and the enduring bonds between fathers and their children. Thank you so much for listening to this story about discovering the letter my father left in his old tractor. These moments of connection across generations remind us that love finds a way to bridge even the deepest silences. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please let me know what part of the world you're listening from, and if this story reminds you of your own family experiences. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about the unexpected ways our loved ones continue to speak to us, even after they're gone. Until next time, remember to look a little deeper when something seems broken. Sometimes the most important discoveries are hidden just beneath the surface.